The bed was not private. It never truly belonged to the bride and groom. In the late Middle Ages, the wedding chamber was a stage, and the first night of marriage unfolded not as an act of intimacy, but as a ritual of power, surveillance, and fear. Behind heavy wooden doors, a new life was supposed to begin, yet the presence of family, priests, and servants ensured that nothing was hidden. The flicker of candlelight on stone walls, the sound of muffled laughter outside, the dread within the heart of a young bride, all told the truth. This was not a celebration. This was judgment. The people of medieval Europe believed that a union was not real until it was sealed in flesh. To them, a marriage without consummation was a lie, a dangerous deception that could unravel alliances, dynasties, and inheritances. The couple's most intimate moment became an affair of the state, and the bedroom itself turned into a courtroom. Curtains drawn around the bed were not barriers, but veils, through which suspicion always seeped. The fear of scandal lingered in every shadow. For noble houses, a wedding was more than a joining of bodies. It was the welding of two bloodlines. Kings and dukes arranged unions as if moving pieces on a chessboard, each bride and groom carrying the weight of treaties and land. The bride's body became a vessel of proof. Only a virgin could guarantee the legitimacy of heirs, and so the first night became a public trial. A priest might stand nearby, his whispered blessing a chilling reminder that the church hovered over every kiss, every touch, every breath. And outside the chamber, drunken guests sang bawdy songs, mocking the fear that clung to the couple like a funeral shroud. Imagine the terror of a girl who had scarcely crossed into womanhood. Some brides were not women at all but children, married before they could understand what was demanded of them. A noble daughter could be promised to a prince while still in her cradle. At 12, she might be led to the altar, veiled and trembling, given to a man she barely knew. Margaret Beaufort was little more than a child when she became the mother of England's future King Henry VII. The scars of that night remained etched in her body and her memory, the price of an alliance carved into her flesh. Such stories were common. The state claimed the innocence of childhood and molded it into a tool of diplomacy. The ritual known as the bedding ceremony was perhaps the most invasive of all. After the feast ended and the torches guttered low, the guests did not drift home to their chambers. Instead, they gathered, voices loud with drink, eyes gleaming with cruel anticipation. The bride and groom were not left to retreat in silence. They were escorted in a procession, marched through the halls while music, laughter, and coarse jokes filled the air. Their attendants undressed them before the crowd, lifting silks from trembling shoulders, pulling boots from unwilling feet. A priest blessed the bed as though it were an altar. And then, beneath a blanket that felt more like a shroud, the couple was left to do what was expected. The audience did not always depart. Sometimes the laughter lingered outside the door, ears pressed against the wood, waiting for proof. The creak of the mattress, the sound of movement, became evidence in the eyes of the community. For peasants, the ritual might be rowdy, a coarse parody of intimacy. For nobles, it was deadly serious. Heirs were at stake. Legitimacy was at stake. The entire future of a dynasty could rise or fall on what happened in that bed. But the most haunting moment came not in the night, but in the cold light of morning. The bed sheets were inspected. If stained with blood, they were paraded as a triumph, hung from windows or displayed before the household. The crimson proof was not a secret, but a proclamation. To all who saw it, the bride had fulfilled her duty. She had bled, and thus she was pure. If the sheets remained clean, however, a nightmare began. The medieval world believed that all virgins bled on their wedding night. It was a falsehood born of ignorance, but it became a law more binding than scripture. A bride whose sheets remained unstained could be accused of deceit. She might be cast aside in disgrace, or worse, punished by her husband's family, her life in peril. Some brides resorted to desperate measures, smuggling small vials of animal blood beneath their gowns, or pricking their fingers to spill a few drops on the linen. Each deceit was a gamble with fate, a chance to survive the judgment of an entire community. The fear of exposure was so strong that it shaped even the rhythm of courtship and alliance. The church, meanwhile, layered this fear with endless prohibitions. To them, the act of marriage was a paradox, necessary for procreation, but tainted by lust. Couples were forbidden from touching on holy days, forbidden during Lent, Advent, and on feast days of saints. They were warned against desire, against passion, against positions other than the missionary. To stray from the rule was to risk damnation. Even in their wedding bed, couples were watched by God's invisible gaze, every movement weighed as a sin or a duty. The air of guilt thickened the chamber like smoke. The wedding night, then, was never free. It was bound by the state, by the church, by family honor, and by superstition. Whispers of darker customs haunted the edges of this world. Peasants spoke of the droit du seigneur, the Lord's right to claim a bride on her first night. Legends told of noblemen summoning trembling girls to their halls, while new husbands waited helpless outside. Historians now believe this was myth, a weapon of rumor used to stain the image of feudal lords. Yet even if no law enshrined it, the fear itself was real. A lord's power was absolute. The bride's body was always vulnerable to command. The myth lived because it carried a truth, that in a world ruled by hierarchy, consent was a fragile illusion. What remains when we look at these nights is not the laughter of feasts or the beauty of gowns, but the weight of fear. Fear of humiliation, of disgrace, of violence. Fear of a community that demanded to see proof of a private act. Fear of the church that turned love into sin. Fear of a husband who might be stranger, master, or child's destroyer. The wedding night was not the beginning of joy, but the rehearsal of submission. In the cold silence that followed, as torches guttered out and whispers filled the halls, a bride might have wondered whether her life had ended before it had truly begun. The morning after a wedding in medieval Europe was often darker than the night itself. The feast had ended, the torches had burned to ash, but the proof of consummation remained under scrutiny. Sheets were lifted, examined, paraded like relics before eager eyes. For families, this crimson fabric was more valuable than gold, for it proclaimed legitimacy, purity, and obedience. Yet for the young bride, the sight of her own blood displayed as spectacle could feel like a silent execution. What was meant to remain between two people had been transformed into evidence, pinned against her like a charge in court. The absence of blood was far more dangerous than its presence. For a girl accused of deceit, there was no defense. Her body was seen as guilty by default, and her word carried no weight. Some were sent back to their fathers in shame, others cast aside in disgrace, their lives ruined before they had begun. The most unfortunate faced violence, for a husband dishonored, was a man emboldened to reclaim respect through cruelty. The sheet became a verdict, and that verdict was often fatal. In this climate of suspicion, myths flourished. Folk remedies promised to guarantee the desired stain. Some whispered that a bride should eat certain herbs, others that she must carry charms sewn into her gown. Desperation made legends believable. There are tales of young women pricking their thighs in the shadows, smearing the cloth with drops of their own blood to avoid disaster. These stories reveal the terror that cloaked the chamber, the unrelenting demand for proof, and the silence of women forced to act as both defendants and executioners of their own fate. Marriage was never only a personal union, it was a political weapon. The child brides given to men twice or thrice their age carried dynasties on their fragile shoulders. Their bodies became battlegrounds for inheritance, their wombs measured as instruments of alliance. The church demanded obedience, the family demanded heirs, and the husband demanded submission. Margaret Beaufort's haunted youth is but one remembered name among thousands who vanished into records of contracts and dowries. Many did not survive childbirth. Many were broken long before they became mothers. Yet their suffering was normalized, wrapped in the language of duty and devotion. The weight of ritual extended beyond noble halls. Among peasants, too, marriage was a public event governed by custom rather than privacy. The bedding ceremony might be rowdier, less solemn, yet no less invasive. Songs mocked the groom, jokes humiliated the bride, and the procession to the bedchamber resembled a carnival of cruelty. Privacy was considered suspicious. What was hidden could not be trusted. The community demanded its right to witness, for legitimacy was not merely personal, but collective. A child born years later was to be acknowledged as the rightful heir of that first night. Without witness, without proof, doubt would gnaw at every inheritance, every claim, every field tilled by the couple's descendants. It is difficult to imagine the silence of a young girl in such a moment. Her voice drowned by laughter, her fear concealed by ritual, her body pressed into a role she did not choose. For some, marriage was a reprieve from harsher fates, for a union could protect a woman from the uncertainties of widowhood or poverty. But for many, the wedding night was the end of childhood, the erasure of innocence, and the beginning of a life marked by expectation and control. The church did little to ease this burden. If anything, it worsened it. Marriage was recognized as a sacrament, yet it was surrounded by a labyrinth of prohibitions. The calendar of intimacy was tightly controlled. Holy days, feast days, fast days, Lent, Advent, and even moments of illness or menstruation all stood as barriers. To break these rules was to risk damnation. Couples were urged to perform the act only as duty, never as pleasure. Priests thundered against lust, calling it a gateway to sin even within wedlock. The bedchamber became a place of guilt as much as fear. A husband and wife could scarcely breathe without feeling the invisible hand of judgment pressing against them. It is no wonder that myths of darker customs emerged. Whispers of the Lord's right on the first night lingered in chronicles, songs, and plays. Peasants spoke in hushed tones of brides summoned to a lord's castle, of noblemen claiming what was not theirs by law, but by power. Historians today dismiss this as a legend, a fabrication used in later centuries to paint the Middle Ages as barbaric. Yet the myth carried weight because it symbolized a truth. Lords did command such authority that resistance was unthinkable. Abuse existed, even if the custom itself did not. The droit du seigneur survives in memory not because it was written into law, but because fear made it real. Power shaped every detail of the wedding night. For kings, the act of consummation could decide the future of nations. Chroniclers recorded whether queens bore heirs, whether alliances flourished or faltered. If a marriage failed, annulment often rested on proof that consummation had not occurred. Trials were held where servants testified to what they had heard or seen through doors. The most intimate act of all could be dissected in legal chambers, discussed in letters, debated among bishops and kings. No secret was safe, no curtain strong enough to shield the newlyweds from the eyes of the world. The ordinary people of medieval Europe may have accepted these customs as natural, yet beneath them pulsed a current of dread. The bed was a stage where love was rarely present. What lingered instead was obligation, humiliation, and fear. And from this foundation, life unfolded. The wife was bound, the husband was bound, and the community bore witness. It was a world where freedom of choice scarcely existed, where the laughter outside the door could sound more like the jeer of an execution crowd than the cheer of friends. When we picture a medieval wedding, we imagine silken gowns, ringing bells, feasts and banners. Yet beyond the pageantry lay a night heavy with shadows, a night where girls grew into women not by choice, but by command. A night where priests, lords, and fathers claimed rights over a body that did not belong to itself. This is why the wedding night became legend. Not because it was joyous, but because it was terrifying. Its echoes can still be heard in whispers, in folklore, in the stained linen preserved in archives as relics of humiliation. And in that silence, in that cold bed surrounded by shadows and judgment, one question remained, unspoken, but inescapable. Was this truly the beginning of life together? Or was it the quiet death of freedom itself? The rituals of the medieval wedding night were not created for the bride or groom. They were created for the community, for the dynasty, for the church, for everyone except the two who shared the bed. That is why fear saturates the chronicles of these nights more than joy. Fear of exposure, fear of failure, fear of being seen as impure. Every whisper, every custom, was built to remind the couple that their lives were not their own. What strikes us now is the silence of those who endured it. The voices of the brides are almost absent from the records, preserved only through fragments, letters, or the judgments written about them by men. Yet their suffering remains visible in the consequences. Child brides weakened by childbirth. Women discarded because blood did not stain the sheets. Noble daughters sent like pawns across borders, their only worth bound to obedience and fertility. Their private terror was woven into the fate of kingdoms. Whispers also filled the halls with legends of defiance. Servants claimed that some brides smuggled knives or charms into the chamber, as if protection could be found in steel or superstition. Others said husbands drank heavily before entering, dulling their sense of shame as well as their conscience. Some stories may be mere gossip, the echoes of servants eager to spread tales. But what cannot be denied is the atmosphere of dread that made such tales believable. By the 16th century, satire and literature often mocked these rituals. Playwrights wrote bawdy scenes of the bedding ceremony. Artists painted grotesque parodies of lords demanding their supposed rights. Yet the laughter contained its own darkness. It revealed how deeply the rituals had scarred memory. They became subjects of ridicule only after centuries of fear had passed. The truth is harsher than the myth. There may have been no universal law granting a lord the first night, yet lords still held power to take what they desired. There may have been no guarantee of blood on the sheets, yet the demand for it destroyed lives. There may have been no voice given to the bride, yet her silence shaped dynasties all the same. Myth and fact blend here, one feeding the other, each revealing a world where control overshadowed intimacy. In the end, the medieval wedding night was not about love. It was about proof. Proof of purity, proof of obedience, proof that alliances could bear fruit. Proof displayed not in the faces of the couple but in the stains of cloth and the whispers of witnesses. The most private act of all was transformed into ritual theater, a play performed for family, church, and state. And so, when we step back from the feasts and the music, from the castles and cathedrals, what remains is a chilling paradox. The night that was meant to begin a shared life together was also the night when individuality ended. The bride became a vessel, the groom a performer, and the community the judge. Freedom was stripped away in silence, leaving behind a union bound not by choice but by command. The past whispers still. Not in the laughter of feasts, not in the clinking of goblets, but in the imagined silence of a chamber where curtains closed and shadows pressed in. A silence broken not by tenderness, but by fear. A silence that asked a question that has never faded. When power turns love into proof, when community turns intimacy into spectacle, what remains of the human soul that was meant to be free?